Welcome into Hittin Hard with Jon Chuckery here on Locked On Sports Atlanta. Today on the show, nobody saw this. Makes you wonder why, and the price was right. It's all next. It's Hittin Hard with Jon Chuckery, Locked On Sports Atlanta.
This is Hittin Hard with Jon Chuckery, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta. And it starts now.
Hittin Hard is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. We ask you to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can get the latest episodes of Hittin Hard as they become available, and then give me a follow on my personal Twitter page at JMCH316. Well, look, nobody saw this coming. Okay, and you can talk about being a homer and all this. Oh, I predicted. No, you didn't. No, you didn't. You're not intellectually honest if you told me that the Hawks would be up by 1 point at 24, go on the road, beat the Miami Heat by 11 points last night. But that's exactly what they did. And look, a great win for the Atlanta Hawks. So everything we talked about yesterday was working against the Hawks, going on the road. You know, they were 3-10 over the last 2 years against Miami. They had lost 7 in a row. The last time they won in Miami was when Lloyd Pierce was fired and Nate McMillan took over for Lloyd Pierce, and they went on that big run, you know, when they changed coaches a few years ago. That's the last time that they had won in Miami. So it's been 7 straight games that they had lost in Miami. And look, we talked about yesterday the idea of, I thought that there were 2 big keys in this game. Trae Young shooting the ball well and the rebounding. So on the first part of it, I thought Trae played really well, but he did not shoot the ball very well. He was 8 for 18 from the field, 1 for 8 from 3. And if you had told me going into that game that the Hawks would shoot, because the Hawks had shot 50% against Miami during the regular season this year. If you had told me that the Hawks would shoot 47% from the field, 24% from 3, and only 59% from the free throw line, I would have told you, and you just said 116-105. I'd have said, well, that's pretty easy to call. That's Miami winning 116-105. What was the difference in the game last night? The hustle, the want to, the hustling after 50-50 balls, the rebounding, the physicality. They gave the Miami Heat a taste of their own medicine, and they matched them blow for blow. And look, we were talking about the rebounding in this series, where the Heat had a definite advantage, and they had out-rebounded the Atlanta Hawks all season long. The Hawks out-rebounded Miami 63-39, and more impressive than that, and this is something that Eric Spoelstra talked about after the game, was they had 22 rebounds. So they had a third of their rebounds, maybe like 35% of their rebounds that were offensive rebounds. And that led to more chances, more second chance points, more opportunities. And Spoelstra talked about that specific thing in his press conference after the game, about the idea of they were getting a lot of second chances. So the hustle, the defensive effort, the rebounding, the physicality, all of these little intangible things that we don't honestly normally see from the Atlanta Hawks, they were able to do last night. And even though that they didn't shoot the basketball very well, they didn't shoot the 3 ball very well, they did just enough to get it done, and they were up by 24. Now, look, I know the third quarter, was one of those things, and we'll talk about the key moment in the game. The third quarter looked like it was going to be a disaster, but you knew that the Miami Heat were always going to make a run. Like, you weren't going to go into Miami and just run them off their floor, right? The Hawks are not a good enough team, and they don't have that drive that just says that they're going to step on somebody's neck and just roll right through a team. It's just not that easy, and especially when you're talking about postseason play and different things like that. Miami's a really good home team. I think they were 27-14 at home. They're a really good home team. You weren't just going to run them off the court. They were always going to throw haymakers at you and get themselves back into that game. But I thought the key moment of the game when the Heat got that thing down to 5 points, and then the Hawks at the end of the third quarter were able to get the lead back up to 11 going into the third. And for all of the great things that Miami did in that third quarter, and for all of the things that went wrong for the Atlanta Hawks in the third quarter, the Heat only outscored them by 2 points because the Hawks had that little run. And I think halfway through the third quarter, the Hawks only had 6 points halfway through the third quarter. But that run at the end of the third, I thought was the difference in the game last night. When they got that lead back up to 11 going into the fourth quarter, you felt like you exhaled and you thought that, okay, Miami gave us our best punches. They took haymaker after haymaker after haymaker, and the Hawks were still standing, and the Hawks were still up for the 10 count in all of it. And I thought that run at the end of the third that got the lead back up to 11 was what the difference in the game was. And then from there, the Hawks were able to trade baskets and things like that, and the Hawks, were able to just keep pace with everything. But look, the bench was another thing in this game. 4 guys. The bench was only 4 guys. The bench was only 4 guys long last night. But every player was in double figures off the bench. They got 53 points from 4 guys off their bench, and they got 19 rebounds and 5 blocks. And Okongwu was a blocking machine last night. And look, he's obviously been one of the guys that has developed over the course of the year. It will be very interesting to see when we get to the offseason about how much of a role that when you start to get a Clint Capella who's getting a little bit older, can Okongwu start to take over more of that spot? And we talked about that here a few weeks ago. Is Okongwu ready to take over a starting role? Look, there is a difference between playing 82 games and starting every night than just coming off the bench. It is a different mentality that you have to have. But certainly from the defensive perspective, Okongwu was a shot blocking machine last night. So again, nobody saw this coming. You're not being honest if you thought that the Hawks were going to go in there and win by 11, because there wasn't a single solitary thing about this Hawks season or what they've done the last couple of years against Miami that told you this. Now, again, you can be a homer and stuff and say that I thought the Hawks were going to win because you're a fan. You weren't looking at it from an analytical perspective. But the Hawks went in there and got it done, which has been a house of horrors for the Atlanta Hawks over the last couple of years. But that was a magnificent win. And now we get ready for Saturday as the Hawks will travel up to what I think is the second best team in the NBA. I think Milwaukee's the best team in the NBA. I think the Celtics are the second best team in the NBA, even over anybody in the Western Conference, over Denver or Memphis or anybody. I think the Celtics are the second best team in the NBA. They may be the deepest team in the NBA. And look, we'll roll the dice again, right? I mean, that's what this is. The Hawks were 0-3 against the Celtics, but that last game really kind of doesn't matter because, the final game of the regular season, the Hawks had Trae and some starters out. The Celtics had guys that they were resting and things like that. So I don't necessarily count that game, but this is going to be kind of a slugfest. And this is, the kind of team and matchup that we want to see what the Hawks can do against a really good team in a series. But a great win for the Hawks last night. Great momentum, great energy, great physicality. They won the rebounding battle. They were more physical. They were more tough. They hustled after all the 50-50 balls. Just everything that, doesn't necessarily always stand out in the box score for the Atlanta Hawks, they were able to do last night and come up with an 11-point victory on the road against Miami. All right, let's talk about our friends over at FanDuel. Major League Baseball season is underway, and no better place to go than FanDuel. And if you're a new customer to FanDuel, you can sign up now to claim your no-sweat first bet, where you can get as much as $1,000 in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up and claim your no-sweat first bet for $1,000 in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. You can bet on who's going to win. You can bet on Aaron Judge if he's going to homer in the game. You can make all kinds of props. You can talk about who's going to, get the victory for a starting pitcher. Everything is available to you at FanDuel.com. So head to FanDuel.com/LockedOn today. That's FanDuel.com/LOCKEDON and claim your no sweat first bet, where you can get as much as $1,000 in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. FanDuel.com/LockedOn, LOCKEDON to sign up. FanDuel's the official sports book betting partner of Major League Baseball. So it does make you wonder why that the Hawks were able to do what they did last night, right? Now, we've talked a lot on this podcast that I think the Atlanta Hawks, their starting five, can play with anybody in the NBA. And when you look at some of the guys coming off their bench, whether it's Griffin or Johnson, Sadiq Bey, I think is a really good offensive piece coming off the bench. Okongwu with the defense and the rebounding and the shot blocking. Bogey coming off the bench. He's arguably your best scorer. This team can really play with most teams in the NBA, and their starting five can hang. Even though last night you didn't get a whole lot out of DeAndre Hunter, who did not play well last night. He picked up the 5 fouls. Even John Collins did not play all that well. Only 1 for 4 from 3, 1 for 3 from the free throw line, 10 points and 4 boards. He was 4 for 8 from the field, but again, those two guys didn't play as well, and it still tells you that with Trae and DeJounte and Capella, who was a rebounding machine, 21 rebounds for Capella last night with 8 offensive boards, it tells you that, makes you, on one hand, it's frustrating, right? Because you see what this team is capable of as far as they can play with anybody in the NBA. And I mean that in the NBA. Milwaukee, Boston, Denver, they can play with anybody in the NBA. Then the excitement part of it is, okay, if Quinn Snyder has a full spring, summer to work with this team and get them ready and get them into camp next year, you feel like that there's a lot of excitement about what could possibly be ahead of the Atlanta Hawks. Now, lots of questions and lots of roster decisions that are going to have to be made here, right? I mean, again, we talked yesterday. I think Trae Young is the one piece that's not going to be moved. But if you told me anybody else on the roster is capable of being moved, I would agree with that. And if the article from The Ringer with Kevin O'Connor and the article that he wrote, if Quinn Snyder really does have final say in personnel decisions, then this evaluation process and what he's done this last quarter of the season, it's going to be very interesting to watch what this team is going to look like moving forward. What pieces, and again, the question still becomes, is Tony Wrestler going to go into the luxury tax? Maybe if they, hang with Boston and okay, you beat Miami, you're looking like you're competitive against Boston and you're playing really well. Maybe you force them to a 7-game, even if you don't win the series. Maybe Tony Wrestler decides that, okay, now is the time that we got to get in the luxury tax. Because I do think Quinn Snyder realizes that, look, you're not going to be a really good franchise unless you get into the luxury tax. You're going to have to spend money to get this roster right. I mean, that's just the reality of it. I mean, guys are going to, get increases in their contracts. Guys are going to get extensions. They're going to make big money. You're going to get into the luxury tax at some point. I think Snyder understands that. But again, it makes you wonder why we haven't seen more of this from the Atlanta Hawks. And look, the Knicks were a 47-win team this year and got the 5th seed in the playoffs. Couldn't the Hawks have won 6 more games? I mean, the Hawks had 41 wins. You mean to tell me that the Hawks couldn't have been 6 games better on their schedule than what they were if they'd have taken care of their business at times against Houston or especially Charlotte, where they were 1-3 against the Hornets, because they were 4-0 against the Pistons, but 1-3 against Charlotte. And I'll go back to that end of the calendar year when they had that 19-game stretch starting the Wednesday night before Thanksgiving, where they had that 19-game stretch where they could have really taken advantage of the schedule and didn't do anything with it. I had predicted a 13-6. They were 7-12. And after that, it just was kind of stagnant the rest of the way through the season. And you look at Quinn Snyder. Look, the Hawks were only 10-11 with Quinn Snyder. I mean, it's not like that Quinn Snyder came in here and, had a, 15-6 run with this team. And, they got that big boost and just changing coaches. We saw that with Nate McMillan when he first got here. We saw it with Brent Key with Georgia Tech. So it's not like they got that big push and that big boost and everything like that. But it does make you wonder why we can't have more nights like that. And maybe it, and I hate to say it this way, maybe Trae is right. I mean, maybe the regular season doesn't matter as much. You wouldn't think that would be the case, given that the Hawks have been the 9 seed last year and the 8 seed this year and just kind of barely navigating their way through everything. You wouldn't like to think that that's really what it is, but maybe when the playoffs come is when the Hawks flip that switch and turn things on, and you say, okay, this looks like a different team. We can't look. The Hawks were a top 10 rebounding team. I didn't see them out rebounding Miami 63-39 last night. And the Hawks are a good rebounding team, but I didn't see that coming. Capella just cleaning up the glass, Okongwu cleaning up the glass, Collins and everybody. I mean, they were magnificent last night. They actually played good defense last night. They were, cleaning up the glass. They were blocking shots. They were hustling after plays. They out-physicaled all of those things. And it's like, okay, why do we not have more nights like this when we're playing Charlotte or Houston? Look, they definitely play down to their competition, but they also play up to their competition. That win a few weeks ago, say what you will about Golden State, right? Golden State's not a very good team this year, and they were dreadful on the road. But you saw on that Friday night that, hey, Clay and Steph and all that group, and they're the world champs and all that kind of stuff, and they came in to State Farm Arena, and the Hawks handled them. Why can't we see more nights like what we got against the Golden States and the Miami Heat last night, instead of nights where it was Houston and Orlando and Charlotte, where we just kind of flutter around and can't figure out a way to win? That's the yin and the yang of it, right? On one hand, you're frustrated because where this team is and where it should be. But on the other hand, you're excited because Quinn Snyder's got a chance to develop and put something together that could be, very successful here in the near future. And look, they're going to have to be a much better franchise going into next year. They're going to have to do what they have to do to become one of the premier teams in this league, and especially if they're going to dip their toe into the luxury tax. So we'll see what happens, but certainly, very good win for the Hawks last night, but you wish that more of those nights had happened through the course of the regular season. All right, after you make Hittin' Hard with Jon Chuckery your first listen, make sure you make Locked On Sports Today your second listen. The biggest stories of the day, instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day, available on Odyssey, YouTube, Spotify, wherever you get all of your podcasts from. Well, the price was right. And listen, this move kind of came out of nowhere for the Atlanta Falcons. Falcons made a trade yesterday to pick up Jeff Okudah, the former number 3 overall pick, who, by the way, was in the same draft as A.J. Terrell. Okudah was selected number 3 by the Detroit Lions. Terrell was selected number 16 by the Atlanta Falcons. Now, going into that 2020 draft, I thought the 2 top corners in that draft were Okudah by a country mile, and then the Henderson kid out of Florida. I thought those were the top 2 corners, and I was very interested in the Falcons getting their hands on one of those guys. Okudah goes to the Lions. He doesn't play as well. Obviously, he's banged up and hurt and things like that. But it is weird that, and I know the relationship with the general manager for Detroit and Terry Fontenot, but it is weird that you have the number 3 overall pick that is traded in his rookie contract. Kind of tells you some things, and especially with the Detroit Lions, when you look at, okay, this is a franchise on the rise. They're getting contributions out of their young guys. I mean, I know Jared Goff's not necessarily a young guy, but Aiden Hutchinson had a really good year last year. Penei Sewell's been a really good player for them. So their last couple of drafts have panned out pretty well. But they were a very bad passing team, and they were not a very good pass defense last year. And Okudah did play 15 games and started 15 games, coming off the Achilles injury the year before. He'd only played 7 games, I believe it was, the first 2 seasons of his career. And just to give you some perspective on the 3-year run for Jeff Okudah, he played 1,297 snaps in 25 games. So that's the reason why his 5th-year option is only $11.5 million, because he doesn't get the additional $1 million by having played the average amount of games for a first-round pick. So that's the number of games and snaps that he's played. That's the reason why he's not getting that extra $1 million, is the fact that, AJ Terrell is a $12.5 million 5th-year option, and Okudah's number is only $11.5 million. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. But 1,297 snaps, a 50.1 overall Pro Football Focus grade, a 40.1 overall coverage grade, 67.8 completion percentage, a 108.2 passer rating allowed, and only 2 games with at least a 70 coverage grade. But when you look at only giving up a 5th-round pick, there is no question that the Atlanta Falcons could never select a player in the 5th round that has the upside that a Jeff Okudah has. And I really like this hire. I saw him a lot at Ohio State. I'm excited about this trade. They got really good value for him. Yes, he's had some struggles. Yes, he hasn't played as much. But here's the key that I'm looking at, okay? And it's 2 words, okay? Jerry Gray. How many times have we come on this podcast and talked about Jerry Gray? And this is going to be the real X factor for this Falcons defense. Jerry Gray, a former DC. He can help out Ryan Nielsen when it comes to play calling and things like that and how to organize everything, because Nielsen's never been a full-time DC in the NFL. Jerry Gray has. Jerry Gray is the assistant head coach for the Atlanta Falcons. So he'll work, in lockstep with Arthur Smith on things. But let's go back in time. We've talked about this. 2010. Where was Jerry Gray? He was in the middle run of his defensive backs coach, which he's spent a lot of time as a defensive backs coach. And he was with the Seattle Seahawks in 2010 when they had a couple of rookies in their defensive backfield named Earl Thomas and Cam Chancellor. And he worked with and helped develop those guys. I'm not giving him all of the credit. Those guys were obviously outstanding players, but you see the influence that Jerry Gray can have. And he spent most of his time the last few years as a defensive backs coach. So if he can work with Okudah and get him right, we could have 2 shutdown guys on the outside. And I still think that it's of value to keep Casey Hayward, even if that means that Hayward plays inside. That way you have a backup plan. First off, you can't have too many corners. And the Falcons have a whole crap ton of corners right now, right? Remember, they signed Cornell Armstrong and guys like that. They still have a whole plethora of guys. They signed Mike Hughes, here in the offseason. So they've got a whole crap ton of guys, Darren Hall. And they've got a lot of players that are in that defensive backfield. But I would keep Casey Hayward. I got no issue. Look, I think he's a $7 million cap hit this year. Falcons have the money. The money's not an issue. Yes, you could pick up $5 million on the cap if you cut him, but what do you need the $5 million for? I'd rather have the player. I'd rather have a good player. And if it's a AJ Terrell, Okudah, Casey Hayward, now we got something cooking. And then you throw in the Jerry Gray factor into that mix. And if he can coach these guys up, whether it's Hawkins, Bates, Richie Grant at safety, whether it's Okudah, AJ Terrell, Casey Hayward, and all the other corners that we have, the Cornell Armstrongs and everybody else, Darren Hall and Mike Hughes and everybody, all of those guys, this could be a really good defensive backfield. So I love the Okudah trade. When you're giving up, think about some of the trades that the Falcons have made. You gave up a 5th rounder for the number 3 pick in the draft 3 years ago, right? And yes, he's not played as well and things like that, but still, the talent and the upside is there. He wouldn't have been picked number 3 in the NFL draft, overall in the NFL draft, if he didn't have the talent and the upside to make it happen. The Detroit Lions would not have picked him, if he was a 5th round talent at number 3 overall. So he's got all of the upside and ability. Then the Jonnu Smith trade, where you gave up next to nothing. I think it was a 6th-round pick to get a Jonnu Smith, who's played with Arthur Smith and could be a real big piece in this offense. Falcons have done some really good work at making trades that you don't give up much in value and you get a lot in return. And I think that this is a really good move for the Atlanta Falcons to get a guy that has this high of an upside. And he was a guy that I really looked at and, wished maybe in a way that the Falcons could find their way to getting an Okudah. But you've got 2 potential number 1 corners now on this team. And everybody, listen, we talk about pass defense and all that kind of stuff. Now this probably clears up a little bit more of the picture of where the Falcons are going at number 8 in the draft. We'll talk more about that tomorrow, specifically about, the draft part of it. But getting Jeff Okudah here, getting him in the mix with this group, getting him in with Jerry Gray to coach him up and help him develop, this is all good news. And if we come out of this, and the 5th-year option, let's talk about that for a second. 5th-year option. I don't think the Falcons will pick up the $11.5 million 5th-year option. By the way, they have till May 1st. So May 1st is when you've got to pick up 5th-year options. They'll pick up A.J. Terrell's 5th-year option for the $12.5 million. But I think with Okudah, what you do is the same thing you did with Kaleb McGary. You don't pick up his 5th-year option, and you let him play things out. And if he doesn't get it together, if he doesn't play well, if he's hurt, then you just don't have nothing connected and you just move on from it. And it only costs you a 5th-round pick to experiment with him for a year. But if he does play well, then and he does ball out, then I'll give him a contract because, again, we're going to have more money on the cap next year. We still have money to spend next season, and you can roll some money over. We'll be fine money-wise on the cap. So I'll do the same thing with him that I did with Kaleb McGary. I'll let him prove it and let him bounce back and see if he can get that, big year under his belt and then roll the dice from there. I don't have a problem with that. So I do think that they will decline the 5th-year option on Okudah and just play this year out and see what he can do in the 4th year and maybe make it a McGary situation. But I really like this move. I think the upside is there. And let me tell you, again, 2 words, Jerry Gray. If he can work with these guys and get them to where we need to be, we might have something special when all is said and done with this defensive backfield. All right, thank you so much for making Hittin' Hard with Jon Chuckery your first listen every day. Make sure you check out Locked On Sports today. Make that your second listen. Biggest stories of the day, instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day. Available Odyssey, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcast from. We ask you to subscribe on YouTube for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. You can get the latest episodes of Hittin' Hard as soon as they become available. And then give me a follow on my personal Twitter page. That would be at JMCH316. We'll be back with you tomorrow. This has been Hittin' Hard with Jon Chuckery, Locked On Sports Atlanta.